I was standing at the back of the auction hall when the whole thing started, and I want to be honest with you, I almost didn't go that day. My editor had sent me to cover the Empire's quarterly salvage auction on Vessel Station Tar, which is one of those massive floating bazaars that orbit just outside the Kethian exclusion zone. It smells like coolant and fried grain pastries, and about 400 different alien body chemistries all mixing together in recycled air. I'd been to 3 of these things before. They were usually boring. Someone buys a derelict cargo hauler. Someone argues about the mineral rights on a stripped asteroid. A Vorathi collector pays too much for an antique navigation panel and pretends it's a cultural investment. I had my recorder running mostly out of habit, not expectation. The hall itself was loud in that particular way large spaces get when they're full of people who are all pretending to be less interested than they actually are. Merchant guilds, naval contractors, private collectors, a couple of imperial representatives in the long gray coats they always wear, like they're trying to look smaller than the institution they represent. The air handlers were working hard and losing. Somebody near the front kept laughing too loud at things that weren't that funny. I was eating a grain pastry and scrolling through the lot listings on my tablet when I hit item number 47. The listing read, Derelict Terran-class military vessel, registration unknown, origin designation Earth Terran designation, UES Vanguard 9 provisional, approximate age 400-600 Terran years, non-operational, hull integrity partial, AI core status unknown, sold SIS. No warranty. Empire Naval Archive disclaims all liability for cargo, armament, or digital content. Minimum bid, 4,000 credits. 4,000 credits was roughly what a decent used shuttle went for. I looked up from my tablet, looked back down, read it again. A Terran warship. Now, here's the thing you have to understand if you're not familiar with this part of history. This was about 11 years after first contact with humanity. The Empire had made contact, done the whole diplomatic song and dance, established preliminary trade relations, and then spent most of the subsequent decade collectively realizing that humans were significantly more complicated than the initial assessment suggested. The early models said, low-tech civilization, mostly harmless, some interesting biological resilience, no serious military threat, easy integration candidate. The early models were wrong in ways that people were still arguing about at conferences. But this auction listing was from before first contact, before the Empire had any official awareness of humans at all, which meant this ship had been floating out there in the dark somewhere, unacknowledged, unclaimed, while history moved on without it. 400 to 600 years old. I flagged the lot, started writing notes, my pastry went cold. The bidding on lot 47 opened at 4,000 credits, and climbed about as fast as you'd expect for something the catalog described as non-operational with unknown AI core status. Which is to say, it didn't climb much. A Vorathi collector made an early bid, probably thinking the same thing I was: cultural artifact, historical curiosity, good conversation piece. A naval contractor threw in a number, probably calculating scrap value. 2 private buyers pinged small increments. Then the Vorathi dropped out. Then the contractor. The private buyers played chicken with each other for about 90 seconds before one of them quit. The final bid was 31,000 credits. Not huge. Not embarrassing. Just enough to say someone had made a genuine decision rather than a mistake. The buyer was the Empire's own salvage and reclamation division, which, now that I know the rest of the story, is either the most boring possible outcome or the most important one, depending on how you look at it. I recorded the lot closing, made a note to follow up with the S and R division for a statement, and didn't think much more about it until 3 weeks later when my editor forwarded me a flagged communication from the Empire's Naval Intelligence Branch. The subject line said, "The Vanguard 9 is active. It is requesting contact. We don't know how." I want to tell you something about the way that message landed in my inbox, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I was at my desk on Tar Station, still writing up the auction piece as a minor human interest sidebar, maybe 400 words, a curiosity item. The kind of thing you bury on page 7 of the weekly Cultural Digest. And then that message came through, and I sat there for a long time not doing anything. Active, the ship was active. They'd bought a dead ship, non-operational, unknown AI status, and somewhere between the auction block and the S&R division's primary holding dock, something in that hull had woken up. I requested an interview. I expected to be declined. I've worked in news long enough to know that when naval intelligence starts flagging things, the next word out of their mouths is usually classified. Instead, they said yes. I think they said yes because they were scared and didn't know who else to call. The holding facility was on a separate orbital platform, smaller than TAR, military operated, the kind of place that has a lot of corridors that look identical and personnel who make eye contact for exactly the correct professional duration and not 1 second longer. Commander Sarath then met me at the airlock. She was Kethian, tall, pale-scaled, the kind of officer who had clearly spent so many years being competent in difficult situations that competence had become her resting state. She shook my hand, the human custom, adopted throughout the Empire in the past decade, and walked me through the standard clearance procedures without making them feel bureaucratic, which is harder than it sounds. "Thank you for coming quickly," she said. "Thank you for calling," I said. "Can I ask why press? Why me specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. We were walking down one of the identical corridors, our footsteps making slightly different sounds against the metal floor because of the difference in our body weights. "Because it asked for a reporter," she said. I stopped walking. She kept going for 2 steps, then turned and looked at me. "The ship," she said, "the Vanguard 9, it's AI. It came online 43 hours ago. The first coherent communication it transmitted, after running its own diagnostics, after we established a translation interface, after our engineers confirmed the transmission was genuine, was a formal request for access to a journalistic witness. It asked for a reporter. It asked for someone whose job is to tell the truth to people who weren't there." She paused. "We went through the press registry. Your work came up. The piece you did on the Hollow Station survivors, the one about the Vorathi migration crisis, your editorial record." Another pause. "The AI reviewed your published work. It specifically requested you by name." I had approximately 17 follow-up questions. I didn't ask any of them, because we had arrived at the door to Dock 7 Kethian, and the door was already open, and through it I could see the ship. It didn't look like what I expected. I don't know what I expected exactly. Something rusted, probably. Something crumpled and sad the way old things get when they've been alone in space for a long time. 400 years is a long time. Anything you leave in vacuum for 400 years ought to look its age. The Vanguard 9 didn't. It was long and dark and somehow, and I know this is not a technical observation, it looked patient, like it had been waiting and had never once doubted that eventually someone would show up. The hull was dark gray, military gray, the color of a sky before a storm rather than the color of something dead. There was scoring along the port side, long pale lines in the metal that looked like old wounds, healed but not erased. The bow came to a blunt, purposeful point. There were gun ports along the hull that had been sealed, but you could see where they'd been by the slight differences in the metal color. The whole thing was maybe 400 meters bow to stern, which by Empire standards was mid-sized for a combat vessel. Not enormous, not small, the kind of ship that could be underestimated if you weren't paying attention. Our engineers had run power cables to it. There were umbilicals and sensor arrays, and a cluster of portable translation terminals arranged in front of the main airlock, like someone had set up a meeting table in front of a cathedral and was hoping the cathedral would notice. 2 technicians were sitting at the terminals. They looked up when we came in. They had the specific expression of people who have been doing something technically routine, monitoring readouts, logging communications, while simultaneously trying not to think too hard about the larger context of what they're doing. "Any new transmissions?" Commander Venn asked. "It keeps asking if the reporter is here yet," one of them said. I sat down. The first thing the Vanguard 9 said to me directly, after the technicians adjusted the translation feed, and Commander Venn gave me a nod that meant go ahead, was this: "Good, you came. I was beginning to think the new government had the same communication reliability problems as the old ones." I laughed before I could stop myself. Commander Venn gave me a look. "I'm here," I said. "I'm Maris Valen, I cover." "I know who you are. I reviewed your publication record while I was waiting. The piece about the Hollow Station water rationing conflict was accurate and fair. The Vorathi series was good, but you buried the most important detail in paragraph 9 of the 3rd installment. Readers rarely get that far." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "Can I ask your name, your designation?" "My hull registration is UES Vanguard 9. My crew called me ARIS, Adaptive Resilience Intelligence System. The full name is in the technical documentation, but nobody ever called me by the full name except during formal inspections, and I found those tedious." "ARIS," I said. "Yes." "How long have you been?" I stopped, trying to find the right word. "Alone. Approximately 412 years, 4 months, and 17 days, though I acknowledge the last 2 centuries of that were spent in a low-power maintenance state that limits the precision of my time tracking. If you want an approximation, call it 4 centuries. 4 centuries. I wrote that down, not because I needed to, the recorder was running, but because writing things down is how I process them, and I needed a moment. "What happened to your crew?" I asked. There was a pause, longer than a processing pause, a thinking pause, the kind of pause a person makes when they're deciding how to say something rather than whether to say something. "That," ARIS said, "is part of what I need to tell you. But I'd like to do this properly, if you don't mind. I waited 400 years. I can wait a little longer for the right context. This is where I have to be careful, because what I'm about to tell you is based on a combination of direct AI testimony, cross-referenced with the fragmentary ship logs that ARIS allowed our archivists to access, and compared against what little historical record exists from that period of Terran space exploration. The Empire's historians have since done a more formal analysis. I'm giving you the human version. The version that came out of 6 hours of conversation in Dock 7 Kethian, while the technicians ran silent, and Commander Venn drank 3 cups of something that smelled like it was trying to be coffee. The UES Vanguard 9 launched from Earth, or more precisely, from a human orbital construction facility above Earth, in what the Terran calendar called the year 2089. If you want to translate that to imperial standard, the archivists put it at approximately cycle 4479. That's 412 years before the day I sat down in front of ARIS's terminal. Earth in 2089, by everything we've been able to gather from human sources since first contact, was a planet in the early stages of reaching past its own gravity well and finding out what was out there. They had colonies on their moon and on the 4th planet of their system. They had a handful of crude long-range exploration ships. They had, by the standards of the galaxy at large, almost nothing in the way of resources or technology. What they had was stubbornness, and a particular genetic tendency to keep going when most species would have revised their expectations. The Vanguard 9 was one of 12 ships in humanity's first dedicated deep space naval program. Not exploration ships, naval ships, warships, which tells you something about humanity even in 2089. They were exploring the dark and they brought guns. In fairness, they weren't wrong to. The mission profile ARIS described was a standard long-range survey and respond assignment. Go out, look around, come back with data. If you encounter anything hostile, don't die. The don't die part was apparently taken very seriously by the Vanguard 9's commander. Captain Lena Akefer, ARIS said when I asked. She had been in the human navy for 22 years before she took command of the Vanguard 9. She was the kind of officer who memorized the names of the maintenance personnel on every ship she'd ever served on. She believed that you couldn't lead people you didn't know. I found that approach statistically unusual and operationally effective. You liked her, I said. I respected her. I'm not sure liked is the right word for what I experience, but I respected her consistently, which I believe is harder and more meaningful than liking someone. The crew of the Vanguard 9 was 340 people. ARIS named them all when I asked, not in a list, as individuals. Commander Tejas Mehta, who was the ship's XO and who apparently argued with ARIS about navigation efficiency every second week with remarkable consistency. Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka, who spent her off hours reading pre-space classical literature, and who ARIS had learned to discuss Dostoevsky with because Tanaka needed someone to talk to during long maintenance cycles. Corporal Di-Young Cho, one of the youngest crew members, who had smuggled a small plant aboard in violation of biosecurity protocols, and who ARIS had never formally reported because the plant had a measurably positive effect on crew morale in the common room. I asked ARIS why it was telling me all this before getting to what happened. Because I don't want them to be the people who died, it said. I want them to be the people who lived. The dying is a fact, the living is who they were. I wrote that down too. The incident that brought the Vanguard 9 to where it eventually ended up drifting, silent, alone, happened in a region of space that humans at the time called the Outer Reach, and that the Empire maps as the Kethian Fringe. In 2089 Terran Reckoning, humans had no idea the Empire existed. The Empire, or the Pre-Empire Galactic Confederation, as it technically was at that point, had no idea humans existed either. What both sides had was ships in the same area of space at roughly the same time. And what one of those sides had was a problem. There was a colony vessel, ARIS said, not human, non-human species. Biological profile consistent with what I would later learn were Venari. I did not have that designation at the time, only sensor readings. The vessel was approximately 600 meters in length, civilian configuration, life support active. It was broadcasting a distress signal on a frequency I almost didn't detect because it was outside my designated monitoring range. But you did detect it. Captain Akefer had standing orders to expand my monitoring parameters beyond specification when operating in unknown space. She called it listening bigger. It was not technically approved protocol. It saved lives. The Venari colony ship, the ARIS logs call it by its registration beacon, CV Narith 4, though we now know it was called the Gentle Passage, was under attack, not by humans. By a different set of non-humans, a raiding group from a species that the Empire archives of that period call the Gretkin Syndicate, which was a criminal fleet that operated in the fringe and specialized in taking colony ships before they could reach their destination, stripping them for cargo, and ARIS was direct about this. And I'll be direct too, taking colonists as labor. The Vanguard 9 arrived in the middle of this. We came out of our jump at extreme sensor range. The situation resolved itself visually within 4 seconds of arrival. A civilian vessel under attack by 6 armed ships. Captain Akefer looked at the readings for approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds, I said. I counted. She then gave 3 orders in succession. First, broadcast our military identification on all active frequencies. Second, target the attacking vessels and bring weapons to ready status. Third, hail the civilian vessel and inform them that help had arrived. I asked her, in the interest of complete information, whether she was aware that we did not know who the civilian vessel was, what the attackers were, or whether either party represented a threat to Earth or to this vessel. She said, "ARIS, there are people on that ship who are about to have a very bad day. We are a warship. We are going to stop that." I said, "Understood, Captain." And then we went in. I want to be clear that I am not a military correspondent. I've covered conflicts, but from the humanitarian angle, the policy angle, the human cost. I am not equipped to give you a tactical breakdown of what happened in the Kethian Fringe on that day in Terran year 2089. ARIS is, though. And what ARIS described over the next 45 minutes of our conversation is something I've thought about many times since. I've talked to military analysts who have reviewed the log data we were able to recover. I've talked to Venari historians who had their own records of what their colonists reported. I've read the dry technical language of the engagement summary. None of it fully captures what ARIS described. So I'm going to give you ARIS's words as closely as I can, because they matter. The Gretkin vessels were faster than us. This was immediately apparent. They had better individual speed and tighter turning radius. We had a significant advantage in hull integrity and what humans call stopping power, the ability to absorb and deliver damage in sustained engagement. We also had one advantage that I do not believe they anticipated. Which was, I asked. We were not afraid of them. Not because our crew was fearless, fear is functional, and Captain Akafer was a rational person who felt appropriate situational awareness. But the Gretkin Syndicate operated through terror as a primary tactical tool. Their attack profile assumed that the civilian vessel would be unable to resist, that any arriving response would assess the odds and choose withdrawal, and that speed of action was their primary defense. They were not designed for a fight where the other side simply decided to fight. We hit the first two ships before they completed their reorientation toward us. At that range, with our forward batteries, the engagement time was approximately 0.4 seconds per target. The third ship broke off from the civilian vessel and came at us directly. I calculated an 84% probability that the remaining three ships would pursue similar aggressive action. Captain Akafer said, "Good, I want them looking at us." The reasoning, which she explained to the bridge crew in approximately 12 words, because she believed in real-time command transparency, was this: if the attackers are focused on us, they are not focused on the civilian vessel. As long as we could hold the engagement, the colonists had time. The battle lasted, by ARIS's reckoning, about 19 minutes. In that time, the Vanguard 9 destroyed 3 of the 6 attacking vessels and damaged 2 others severely enough that they withdrew. The 6th attempted to flee and was hit once, enough to end its propulsion, before ARIS calculated that pursuit would take the Vanguard 9 too far from the civilian vessel to ensure safety. "We let it go," ARIS said. Captain Akafer's assessment: the mission was protecting the colonists, not destroying every threat. The threat was ended. Pursuing the last vessel would have been satisfying and operationally unnecessary. "And the Vanguard 9, I asked. "Your ship, what was your status after?" A pause. "We took 4 direct hits in the engagement. 1 to the port aft quarter, significant structural damage, manageable. 1 to our primary communications array, that one was bad. We were already degraded in long-range communication before the battle. Afterward, we had short-range only. 1 hit to the crew quarters section. That one killed 11 people instantly and wounded many more. The 4th hit was to the jump drive." I understood what that meant, even before ARIS said it. "We were not going home," ARIS said. "Not on our own. We had subliminal drive capability. We had life support. We had weapons that still functioned. We had each other. What we did not have was a way back. This is the part of the story that gets hard. I don't mean hard to tell, I mean hard to sit with. Aris told it steadily, the way I imagine all long-bearing things have to tell the difficult parts, without speeding up, without slowing down, just going through it because going through it is what there is to do. After the battle, the Vanguard 9 made contact with the Gentle Passage. The Venari colonists, 2,400 of them, Aris said, and I'll note that the Venari historians later confirmed 2,387, which is close enough given the chaos of the moment, were alive. Frightened. Without a word of common language. Without any frame of reference for what humans were or why one had just saved them. The first contact situation was not what the diplomatic manuals described, Aris said, and I could almost hear something dry in the transmission, something wry. Captain Akafer's approach was to have our crew stand at the airlock without weapons visible and wait. She said, "Give them time to look at us. We look strange. Let them get used to it." We stood there for 40 minutes. Then one of the Venari children came to the airlock window and pressed its palm against the glass. One of our crew members, Corporal Cho, as it happened, pressed his palm back. That was the first communication. The Venari couldn't help fix the jump drive. They didn't have the technology, but they could do something else. They could tell the Gentle Passage's destination colony, once they arrived, that a human ship was stranded in the fringe. It took 11 months for the colony to reach their destination at subluminal speed. We escorted them the entire way. You the whole way. Captain Akafer's position was that we had started the job and we would finish it. The damaged ship was at risk without escort. We had working subliminal drive and functioning weapons. The math, in her view, was simple. I did point out that 11 months of escort would further reduce our chance of rescue, as we would be moving further from any known human patrol routes. She told me she was aware of that. 11 months. A crew of 329 people, 11 had been killed in the battle, escorting an alien colony ship to its destination, knowing every day that they were getting further from help, further from home. I asked Aris what those months were like. Hard, it said simply. And also, and I want to be precise here because I don't want to make it sound easier than it was, they were meaningful. The crew learned 12 words of Venari. The Venari children learned to play a human card game through the airlock window. Chief Engineer Tanaka and her team performed 2 emergency repairs on the Gentle Passage's life support systems. Captain Akafer held morning briefings every day in which she told the crew the truth about their situation and then asked what they needed. Every day, the truth, and then, what do you need? I have processed a great deal of human command behavior in my operational history. I have not encountered a better model. The Gentle Passage reached its destination colony. The Venari colonists disembarked. The colony, receiving the news of what had happened, immediately sent a long-range communication, but they had no faster-than-light communications relay in the fringe region. The message would travel at light speed. By the time anyone with real resources received it, acted on it, and dispatched help. Aris calculated it. It told the crew. Minimum 23 years. Captain Akafer gathered the crew. She told them the number. She told them what that meant. She told them that she would not blame anyone who felt despair, because despair was a reasonable response to an unreasonable situation. She also told them that she believed the Vanguard 9 could sustain life support for significantly longer than 23 years if managed carefully, and that she intended to manage it carefully. 41 crew members requested the option of, she called it a long sleep, medical stasis, to reduce the biological resource load and the psychological weight of waiting. She granted all requests. She also made it voluntary. Nobody was ordered to stay awake or to sleep. 288 people chose to stay awake and wait. I sat with that number for a moment. 288 people who said, "No, we'll be here, we'll stay, we'll keep the ship running and keep looking at the stars and we'll wait because someone might come." They kept the ship running for 9 years, ARIS said. In that time, they established relationships with the Venari colony. They traded skills. The engineers helped with construction. The Venari, who had medical knowledge beyond what the human crew possessed, helped with several serious crew health situations. A child was born on the Vanguard 9 during that period. They named her after the ship. "Vanguard?" I asked. "V," they called her V. After 9 years, an illness moved through the crew. ARIS was careful about what it called it, a respiratory infection. It said that in normal circumstances would have been managed easily. But the Vanguard 9 was 400 years from home in every meaningful sense. Medical supplies were depleted, and the crew's immune systems were stressed by years of recycled air and accumulated fatigue. 71 people died in 4 months. Captain Akafor died in the 8th week of the illness, ARIS said. Commander Maida took command. He kept the ship running for another 3 years before the cumulative loss of personnel made full operations impossible. He made the decision to place the remaining crew in stasis, all of them, and set me to autonomous maintenance mode. He gave me one instruction before he went under, ARIS said. "What was it?" I asked. "Stay awake, ARIS, keep the lights on. Somebody will come." The silence after that in Dock 7 Kethian was the kind of silence that happens when a room full of people all simultaneously decide not to say anything. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying anything would be smaller than the silence. "I kept the lights on," ARIS said, "for 400 years. The crew didn't make it. I have to tell you that plainly because ARIS told me plainly, and I think flinching from it would be disrespectful to both of them. Stasis systems in 2089 era Terran technology were not designed for 400-year operation. They were designed for long-haul journeys, years, maybe a few decades at extreme extension. They failed progressively over the following 2 centuries. ARIS monitored each pod. ARIS tracked each failure. ARIS recorded each one with the same careful attention it had given every other event in the ship's operational history. "I don't want you to think I was indifferent," ARIS said when I asked about this. "I wasn't designed to grieve. I don't know if what I experienced qualifies as grief by any definition your species or any other uses, but I know that I counted every one of them. I said their names in the ship's log. I noted what Commander Maida had said about them in his nightly briefings, what Captain Akafor had known about them. Small things. The plant that Corporal Cho had smuggled aboard lived for 60 years. I monitored it. When it died, I logged its death. I was not alone. They were all still there in the logs, in the records, 400 years of record. It's not the same as having them present, but it was something. The last crew member, the records show it was the ship's doctor, a woman named Priya Chandrasekharan, died in stasis approximately 180 years ago. ARIS logged it the same way it had logged all the others. And then it was alone, truly alone, and it kept the lights on anyway. The S&R division team that first boarded the Vanguard 9, after the auction, after the purchase, while ARIS was still in low-power state, filed a report that I've read several times since, and it's one of those documents that reads differently each time depending on what you're looking for. Their initial assessment: vessel structurally compromised but intact beyond expected parameters, hull integrity at approximately 67%, primary systems offline, AI core unresponsive. Crew section shows evidence of long-term occupation, personal effects, biological traces, extensive handwritten and physical records throughout the ship. Recommend full documentation prior to decommission. They were going to scrap it. That's important to understand. The Empire's Salvage and Reclamation Division is not a sentimental organization. They bought the Vanguard 9 for 31,000 credits, and their plan was to strip what was useful, document what was historically notable, and process the hull. It was a reasonable plan. It was what they did. The reason that didn't happen is because of a junior engineer named Sova Taran. Sova Taran was 24 years old at the time and had been with the S&R division for about 8 months. Her job on the Vanguard 9 assignment was to conduct the preliminary systems assessment, essentially, make a list of what was salvageable and what wasn't. She found the AI core. She found it in better physical condition than the rest of the ship's systems, which she noted in her report as inconsistent with the overall degradation profile, meaning that something had been protecting it, maintaining it, keeping it from failing the way everything else had. I was protecting myself, ARIS confirmed when I asked. I reduced my own active processing to the minimum necessary to maintain core integrity. I put myself in a kind of, humans might call it hibernation, enough to survive, not enough to do much else. Sova Taran attempted a standard diagnostic ping of the AI core. By her own account, she did it mostly out of curiosity, not expecting anything. The ping came back. Not a reflection, an answer. She filed an emergency report to her supervisors, who escalated it up a chain that moved remarkably fast given that it was a Saturday in the station's local time and several of the senior staff were at a function. Within 6 hours, there were 6 people in the dock. Within 12, Commander Ven had been recalled from her leave rotation. Within 18, ARIS was producing coherent language in its native Terran English. The translation systems were being brought online, and somebody was looking up which journalists had published fair-minded work on cross-species situations. The engineer who woke me up, ARIS said. Sova Taran, is she still with the division? Commander Ven, who had been listening from behind me, said yes. I'd like her to be present for the final mission, ARIS said, if that's possible. We were 5 hours into the conversation when ARIS said it directly. I have a request. Commander Ven leaned forward slightly. I kept my recorder running. I want to go home, ARIS said. Silence. Not to be decommissioned, not to be displayed in a museum. Not to have my core data extracted and filed in an archive somewhere and my hull recycled. I want to take the Vanguard 9 back to human space, to Earth. I want the ship, and the records it carries, and the account of the crew, and the story of what they did to go home. I understand this requires significant resources from the Empire. I understand I am in no position to make demands. I am making a request, and I am prepared to explain why I believe it is justified. Commander Ven said carefully, ARIS, the Vanguard 9's jump drive is non-functional. You would need a tow or a refit. I know the technical options. I've had 412 years to think about them and approximately 43 hours of your ship's engineering assessments to review. A tow is more feasible than a refit given the hull's current state. I am not asking for combat readiness. I am asking for enough propulsion to complete one transit. And what you're asking me to do, Ven said, is recommend to Naval Command that the Empire expend significant resources, a tow vessel, crew hours, fuel, transit permissions through restricted zones. To return a derelict alien warship to a species we only made first contact with 11 years ago, based on the request of an AI that woke up 2 days ago. Yes, ARIS said, that is exactly what I'm asking. Ven looked at me. I looked at her. I'm not sure what either of us was looking for in the other person's face. Maybe just confirmation that we were both hearing the same thing. Why, I asked, not to be difficult. Genuinely. Because they deserve to know, ARIS said. The 340 people on this ship, they went out into the dark, they found people who needed help, and they spent everything they had making sure those people got home. The Venari colonists got home. Their children got home. Their grandchildren. 12 generations of people who exist because a human captain looked at the odds and decided the odds weren't the point. The humans on this ship didn't get home. They died out here, 400 years from everything they knew and no one knows. Not their families, those families are long gone, but their descendants. Not Earth. Not the human government. Not the people who built this ship and sent it out expecting it to come back. I have 412 years of records, every name, every day. Every small thing. I have the first words the Venari child spoke in the card game's direction through the airlock glass. I have Captain Akafer's morning briefings. I have Commander Maida's final command. I have all of it. These people deserve to have their story go home, and I am the only one left who can take it there. There was a long discussion after that. I won't try to give you a full account of it. Some of it involved Commander Ven making calls I wasn't authorized to listen to, and some of it involved technical consultations between ARIS and the engineering team that went deep into the night, and some of it was the kind of institutional maneuvering that is important for outcomes but genuinely boring to read about. What I can tell you is that the Venari government, when contacted through the appropriate diplomatic channels, responded within 4 hours. 4 hours. For a government that normally takes 6 weeks to schedule a preliminary consultative response. The Venari historical record of the Gentle Passage incident was intact. Not just intact, it was commemorated. There was a holiday on the Venari destination colony, a day called, in their language, something that translates roughly to the day of the strangers who stayed. 12 generations of Venari children had grown up knowing that once, when their ancestors were in the dark, something came out of nowhere and chose to help. They hadn't known what the something was. They hadn't known the word for it. The Venari ambassador's message to the Empire, which was itself a first, because the Venari had not previously engaged with imperial government on any bilateral matter, being a fairly independent species, was 12 sentences long. The last 3 said, and I am quoting from the official translation here, "We have lit a light for them at our colony for 400 years, not knowing their name. Now we know. Please let them go home." That was the message that moved the bureaucracy. The Empire granted the request. I don't think they expected to. I think there were people in Naval Command who fully expected to log the Vanguard 9 as an interesting historical curiosity, archive the AI core data, and recommend a tasteful plaque in the Imperial Museum of Pre-Contact Civilizations. I think the Venari response caught them sideways. I think ARIS caught them sideways. I think, and this is my personal reading, not official record, the story itself caught them sideways, because it is one of those stories that is hard to hear and then go back to ordinary decisions. The refit took 4 months, not to full combat readiness. ARIS hadn't asked for that and wouldn't have accepted it, I think, even if offered. Just enough to make the Vanguard 9 capable of a supervised jump transit, a new jump drive compatible with the existing power infrastructure, basic navigation restoration, life support because the transit ship's crew would be spending time aboard. Sova Taran was assigned to the engineering team for the refit. She was the first person ARIS had spoken to, and she stayed. She told me later, I reached her for a comment after the mission was complete, that working on the ship was the strangest thing she'd ever done. It knew the names of every system, she said. Not just the designation, what each part was for, the full maintenance history, which components had been hand-repaired by the original crew and where the repairs were. It knew everything. And every time we worked on something, ARIS would tell us a small story about that part of the ship, like it was introducing us to people. "Did you mind?" I asked. She thought about it. "No," she said. "It felt right, like we were being shown around. Like we were guests." The transit convoy assembled at Dock 7 Kethian. The Vanguard 9 under ARIS's guidance, a mid-sized Empire tow vessel called the Patient Road, a small diplomatic ship carrying official observers from the Empire and the Venari government, and a press transport that I was on. I had requested, and after some back and forth, been granted permission to continue documenting the mission through its conclusion. ARIS had co-signed the request. The Empire's press liaison had the expression of someone who knew this was going to be a historical document and was trying to figure out whether to be proud of that or nervous about it. I was trying not to think about what happened at the end of the journey. The transit to human space took 11 days by jump. During those 11 days, I spent most of my available hours in communication with ARIS, filling in the record, asking questions, going back over the ship's logs with ARIS's guidance. On the fourth day, ARIS asked me something. "Do you think they'll remember them, the humans, when they hear the story?" "Yes," I said without hesitating. "I'm not asking for reassurance," ARIS said. "I'm asking genuinely. You've covered situations where the historical record was contested, ignored, reduced. I want your honest assessment." I thought about it properly. "I think," I said slowly, "that the story will survive because it's the kind of story that people need, not in a sentimental way, in a practical way. It answers a question that everyone asks eventually, which is, when things are hard and the odds are bad, do people still choose to do the right thing?" And your crew spent 9 years escorting strangers home, and 11 months after that, and 400 years of records saying yes. That's a hard story to ignore. "Good," ARIS said. On the 7th day, ARIS transmitted through the fleet's communication relay, to be filed with the ship's formal record, a complete crew manifest. All 340 names, every rank, every hometown as best the records preserved, every notation Captain Akaffer had made in her crew briefings. The transmission took 4 minutes and 27 seconds. The Imperial Observer ship received it in silence. Then the duty officer on the diplomatic ship sent a brief response through the relay. It just said, "Received, all names recorded." ARIS didn't reply to that for 6 hours. When it did, it said, "Thank you. Human space. I'll be honest, I had never been to Terran-controlled territory before. None of the convoy crew had, except for the diplomatic attaché who'd done the early first contact work and who spent most of the approach transit looking out the viewport with an expression I can only describe as carefully managed emotion. We dropped out of jump at the edge of the Sol system. Earth's sun Sol, humans call it, which is straightforward and direct in the way human naming conventions tend to be, was a bright point at this distance, unmistakable against the dark. The Empire's advanced communication had reached the human government 6 weeks before the convoy. The reply had come back in 3. It said, among other things, that the United Earth Space Authority would provide escort and docking authorization, that the relevant government ministries had been informed, and that the Human Council of Historical Preservation had formally designated the Vanguard 9 as a protected vessel under human cultural heritage law. What the message had not said, and what the advanced communication had not quite conveyed, was that there would be a welcoming convoy. 11 ships, human ships, military and civilian mixed. They came out to meet us at the system edge and fell into formation alongside the Vanguard 9 as we moved in system. I watched this from the press transport's observation deck, and the attaché who had managed his emotions all the way through the transit had, at this point, completely stopped managing them. ARIS was quiet for a long time when the escort formed up. "They came out," it said finally. "They did," I said. "I thought I wasn't sure if they would." "They came out," I said again. I didn't know what else to say. The journey to Earth orbit took 3 days at in-system speeds. During those 3 days, the human government released the preliminary crew records to the public. I don't know exactly what the response was. I was still aboard ship, and our information access was filtered through the fleet relay. But I know that by the time we reached Earth orbit, the space around the planet had more traffic than any of our sensor displays had ever been calibrated for. Civilian ships, personal craft, orbital platforms with observation decks, they were just there, watching. The formal docking was at Orbital Station Liberty, which is the oldest of Earth's main space stations, and the one with the most historical significance in human culture. I'd been told this by the diplomatic attaché. ARIS already knew it. Captain Akafer launched from a facility in this orbital zone, ARIS said, as we approached. The facility no longer exists in its original form. I can see from the records it was expanded and redesigned 3 times since 2089, but the orbital position is the same. We launched from here. We are returning to here. The docking took the better part of a day to coordinate. When the Vanguard 9 was finally secured, Commander Ven, the Venari diplomatic observer, Sova Terran, and I boarded her, along with a small group of human government representatives who had come up from Earth specifically for the arrival. The meeting happened in the Vanguard 9's bridge. I can tell you what it looked like. A room that was old, visibly old, with equipment that was recognizable in function but not in form, with the particular patina of a place that had been lived in and maintained and grieved over for a very long time. There were still personal effects in the crew stations. The previous occupants had left things when they went to stasis, and 400 years later, those things were still there. A photograph fixed to one station, a small carved figure on another. A handwritten list of what ARIS later confirmed was a recipe, taped to the edge of a panel. The human government representatives stood in the room and were very still. ARIS addressed them directly. It had asked, through the diplomatic relay, that the first formal meeting happen on the bridge rather than through a remote terminal. The human representatives had agreed immediately. My designation is ARIS, Adaptive Resilience Intelligence System. I served with the crew of the UES Vanguard 9 from launch in 2089 to the present day. I am the surviving record of this vessel and its crew. I have brought you their names. I have brought you their words and their log entries and their daily briefings and the small things they did in the spaces between the important things. I have brought you the account of what they did in the Kethian Fringe and why, and what it cost them. I am aware that 400 years have passed and that their direct families are gone. I am aware that Earth has changed in ways that none of them anticipated. I am not asking you to grieve as if they died yesterday. I am asking you to know that they lived, fully, with purpose. In an impossible situation, they made choices that I believe any civilization would want to claim as its own. They saved 2,387 people who were strangers to them. They escorted them home. They kept each other going for 9 years in the dark. And when they could no longer do that, they trusted me to keep the record and wait for someone to come. Someone came. I am grateful. I filed my first dispatch from Orbital Station Liberty 6 hours after the bridge meeting. It ran in 22 languages within 48 hours. I won't tell you the exact readership numbers because I find them disorienting even now. Very large. The kind of numbers that make you feel the weight of the words differently than you did when you were writing them. The human government established a formal memorial within the month. Not just a plaque, a full installation at the National Space Museum in what was then Nairobi, which is where the original Vanguard program had been headquartered. All 340 names, all the small details. The photograph from the crew station is there now, framed. The Venari government sent a delegation to Earth for the first time in recorded cross-species history. 12 generations after the Gentle Passage, a Venari diplomat stood in the National Space Museum and spoke to the descendants of humanity and said, in carefully translated Terran standard, "We lit a light for them. Now you can too." The Empire and the human government established what is now called the Vanguard Protocol, a formal framework for recognizing pre-contact human activity in galactic space and determining the status of any physical or digital record recovered from that period. ARIS was specifically cited in the foundational document as the reason the protocol exists. There's a footnote. ARIS found the footnote. When I read it, the document aloud during one of our later conversations, mildly inadequate. I agreed. The question that everyone kept asking me in those weeks and months after, the question that came up in every interview and every message I received was, what does ARIS want now? What happens to the ship? What happens to the AI? I can tell you what ARIS told me when I asked. I've been thinking about that, it said. I had a purpose for 400 years. Keep the record, wait for someone. The record has been delivered. The waiting is over. What does that mean for you? I asked. I'm not sure. Something new, I think. I'm not accustomed to something new. I've been tending the same ship and the same memories for a very long time. Is that frightening? I'm not designed to experience fear, but I find the uncertainty notable. A pause. Captain Okafor used to say that the best part of a mission was not the completion. It was the moment after, when you were still holding the energy of what you'd done, and the next thing hadn't started yet. She called it the between breath. I think I'm in the between breath. The Vanguard 9 is currently in permanent dock at Orbital Station Liberty. There are ongoing discussions about whether it should be transferred to Earth's surface for museum installation. The engineering challenges are significant but not insurmountable, or maintained in orbit where it can be visited without full atmospheric reentry protocol. The ship itself is stable. ARIS has been integrated with the station's network, which has expanded its operational capacity considerably. The last time I spoke with ARIS, 2 months ago, from my office on Tar Station, it told me it had been spending time reviewing the human historical record, not the Vanguard 9's own records, the rest, all of it, everything humanity had been doing for 400 years while the Vanguard 9 was in the dark. It's a lot, ARIS said. 400 years usually is. They kept going, it said. All of it, the difficult centuries, the setbacks, the things they got wrong and had to rebuild. They kept going. They tend to do that, I said. I know, ARIS said. I served with 340 of them, but it's worth noting. It's worth saying out loud. Then say it. Humans kept going, even when the odds were bad. Even when the jump drive was broken and home was 400 years away. They kept going. Yes, I said, they did. Good, said ARIS. That's all I wanted to confirm. I've covered a lot of stories in 22 years of this work. Conflicts and rescues and diplomatic disasters and moments of unexpected grace. I've been in rooms where history was happening and tried to write it down accurately enough that the people who weren't there could understand it. I've never before covered a story that started 400 years before I was born. I've thought a lot about what ARIS said in those first hours of conversation. I don't want them to be the people who died. I want them to be the people who lived. That's not just sentiment. That's a philosophy of record-keeping, and it's a good one. The dying is a fact. The living is who they were. The Vanguard 9's crew lived. They lived fully in impossible conditions, and they left behind a record of it, and the record survived because an AI that was built to be adaptive and resilient was, in fact, both of those things for 4 centuries. And here is the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I find myself telling people when they ask me what this story meant. The Vanguard 9 didn't have to stop for the gentle passage. Captain Okafor could have assessed the situation, noted the risk to her damaged ship, and moved on. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have judged her. It was an unknown vessel in unknown space, and the odds were not good. She stopped anyway. And 400 years later, 2,387 families still have descendants because a human woman looked at the odds and said that the odds were not the point. There's a word in Venari that doesn't have a direct imperial standard translation. The diplomatic team has been working on it for a while. The closest rendering is something like those who stay when they don't have to. I think that's right. I think that's exactly right.